Hi everyone, we're here today to talk about why the US joined World War II. You saw the clip from Pearl Harbor the other day, so we're going to look at what happened prior to that event and then after that event to help us better understand why we got involved. So make sure you write down the title and our essential question, which is were we justified in entering World War II? I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of historical context, so what was happening in Europe prior to our involvement. This may be a review for you, so just make a note of what you need to understand kind of the context of our involvement. So in World War II, Germany starts the conflict, unlike World War I, which was Austria-Hungary. Germany had been attacking other nations like Czechoslovakia, trying to expand their empire, and Britain and France had kind of looked the other way. So they participated in something called appeasement. You can see the word appeased in red on the screen, and that basically means giving in to an aggressor's demands. So Hitler invaded a country, and Britain and France said, like, hey, knock it off. And he's like, yeah, okay, sure. And then he invades another country, and Britain and France say, seriously, knock it off. Basically, they were trying to avoid another war with Germany, which is understandable given what they'd been through in World War I, but giving into an aggressor's demands never works. It just reinforces the behavior. So the final straw was when Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and that's when Britain and France declared war on Germany. So that's the official start of the war in Europe. We are not involved at this point, but that's what starts the war between Britain, France, and Germany. Our position at this point is neutrality, which we've seen that word before, so there's a trend in history. Whenever you see a trend, you should definitely make a note of that. It's the exact same foreign policy as the beginning of World War I. We were not interested in getting involved or taking any sides. In fact, most Americans, over 60%, thought that our involvement in World War I had been a mistake, so they weren't interested in getting involved in another European conflict. In addition to that, this was also when the Great Depression was happening, globally, but also in the United States, and our president at the time, FDR, and other politicians thought that it would be more important to focus on domestic issues, helping our nation deal with the Depression, versus getting involved in a European conflict. So there are two acts passed, one at the very start of the war in Europe and then one a couple years later that support this idea of neutrality. The first is the Cash and Carry Act, which you see on the left-hand side. So that was implemented right after the war starts in Europe. And basically we said, listen, we'll sell weapons to whoever wants them. We're not going to take a side. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, we don't care. We'll sell them to whoever we want, or whoever wants them rather, as long as they do two things. One, they pay cash for them, and two, they come and get them. So if you remember from World War I, when we lent money to both sides, Britain and Germany, we didn't do it evenly, which influenced our kind of bias or who we wanted to win the war. We're trying to not do that this time, so we're not loaning money. If you want to pay for it, great, they're all yours. Also, we don't want to bring them to you, so we're not going to cross the Atlantic and risk our ships getting attacked again, which is what dragged us into World War I. So if you want them, come and get them. So we really seem to be, with the Cash and Carry Act, trying our very best to not get dragged into this conflict. Our policy changes in March 1941, where we changed the cash and carry policy into the Lend-Lease Act, which is a little bit less neutral, maybe. So if you look at the second bullet point, it says that we could lend or lease, borrow, basically, weapons to any country that was vital to our defense. So now we get to kind of pick and choose. Maybe Germany's not vital to our defense. Maybe Britain is. So we don't necessarily give weapons to whomever wants them at that point. We're making some decisions about who we're going to lend weapons to. We also no longer require that they have cash for them. So you'll notice in the bottom it says just pay us back at the end of the war when you can. So Britain and France, for example, were economically struggling at this point because of the war, and they'd also been through a global depression. So we're like, it's fine, just pay us back later. So while we are still technically neutral, not taking any sides, you can see that we're a little bit more biased in our policy with the Lend-Lease Act than we were with the Cash and Carry Act. So that's what's happening in Europe, but that's not why we got involved in the war. When we looked at the bombing at Pearl Harbor the other day, that was Japan. So let's talk a little bit about what was happening in Asia and how that conflict or that issue between us and Japan got started. So Japan had, for a long time, used this policy of isolationism, specifically regarding trade. So they were like a self-contained nation, not trading with other countries, not really interested in expanding their trade networks. And that changes. But because Japan is an island, they have limited resources. So once they decided to open up trade again and kind of expand their economy, they needed resources like iron, coal, oil, etc. So they started invading other countries to get it. And on the map, you can see where they were targeting. So like Manchuria, for example, Philippines, New Guinea. So all those different areas in Southeast Asia. This caused concern for us because we traded a lot with those areas. If you remember with imperialism, we were really interested in having colonies near Asia because of trade relationships. So Japan's kind of messing stuff up for us. They're meddling in our business. And as early as 1911, our military had actually started planning for a war with Japan. That's 30 years before Pearl Harbor. So we knew that there was probably some sort of conflict that was going to happen with us in Japan. It was just a matter of when. In 1921, things get a little bit more tense with us in Japan because we established the Washington Naval Treaty, which limits the naval development of both nations, so trying to not get into an arms race with Japan regarding our Navy. But the treaty says, like, Japan's Navy has to be smaller than ours. So Japan was not super jazzed about that either. In 1940, Japan aligns themselves with Germany and Italy, which they're at war with our allies, Britain and France. Japan did this because they'd hoped that with war and hopefully victory for them, they would be able to get more resources. So they were really looking at, again, access to those resources and expanding their empire. In the summer of 41, Japan takes more aggressive action to get control of the rest of Indochina, and we gave them an ultimatum. We said, listen, like, stop it, or we're going to cut off all of trade relationships with you. And this was significant because at the time, Japan got 80% of their oil from us. So we knew that if we cut trade off with them, they would only last about 6 months before their military machine would stop running, where they didn't have the things that they needed, the resources to be able to keep their military going and invading those areas. Japan knew the same thing. They knew they had about 6 months. So they kind of backed them into a corner and said, like, either do what we want or we're going to force you to. And that's why Japan attacks at Pearl Harbor. It wasn't out of the blue. It wasn't like, hey, what do you guys want to do today? Like, I don't know, let's attack a U.S. naval base. They felt like they had no other choice, that either they did what we wanted, or they would have to fight back to ultimately push forward their agenda. So the attack on Pearl Harbor is often described as like a surprise attack. That's a little misleading. We knew that at some point Japan we were going to be in a war with them. We'd been planning for it for 30 years. But we really expected that they would attack probably in the Philippines, not in Hawaii, because the Philippines are obviously much closer to Japan. We still controlled the Philippines after we had gotten them from Spain. So that's what we were looking for. We didn't expect Hawaii, mainly because it was a difficult mission for Japan. They had to like refuel their planes midair. It was stuff that they had never done before. So we really didn't expect it in Hawaii. But the attack overall wasn't that big of a surprise. You can see there the amount of damage that was done. So they did significant damage. You also saw that in the video, which then influences the president's decision. The very next day, he goes to Congress looking for a declaration of war against Japan. It was described as a day which will live in infamy, and we'll take a look at his actual speech tomorrow. Congress votes to declare war, and only one person votes against it, so it's only almost unanimous. This is different than what we saw with World War I. There was more apprehension, like a lot more slower moving with getting involved in war, but possibly because of the scale of the attack, we moved pretty quickly. It could also be that our military had proven themselves once already in World War I, so we were more confident in getting involved in this kind of a conflict. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor, we are officially involved in World War II. We're involved on the side of the Allies, same team basically, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. It was Russia during World War I, but now the Soviet Union. And we're fighting against Germany again, but then also with Japan and Italy. So we've got two issues. Japan's really our primary concern because they attacked us directly, but we're going to go ahead and help out Britain and France with Germany because they're getting their butts kicked at this point in Europe. So we end up fighting in Europe as well as in Asia. So we'll take a look at what that looks like in different areas coming up.